There are secrets that only numbers can reveal. Patterns invisible to the eye, but crystal clear on the pages of a ledger. Discrepancies no one questions because no one knows how to read the records. And sometimes, when someone finally learns to decipher those numbers, the truth that emerges is more disturbing than any lie. This is the story of how a girl who shouldn't have known how to write her own name became the only person capable of maintaining the financial records of one of the largest plantations in South Carolina, and how, in doing so, she discovered something that should have remained buried forever. Sarah was 8 years old when she realized she could see patterns where others saw only confusion. It wasn't magic, it was simply the way her mind organized the world around her. On Fairmont Plantation, where she'd been born, and where her mother worked in the houses, Sarah spent her days caring for the younger children while the adults fulfilled their tasks. But even in this seemingly simple occupation, her mind was always working, always calculating, always seeing connections that others missed. She counted everything. How many steps from the cabin to the creek? Exactly 247 if you walk the worn path, 231 if you cut through the tall grass behind the smokehouse. How many children wore shoes versus how many went barefoot? The ratio changed with the seasons, 12 with shoes in winter, only 3 in summer when the leather was needed for fieldwork. How many days passed between food distributions? Every Saturday at dawn unless it rained, in which case Mr. Vance delayed until Sunday, presumably because he didn't want to walk through mud. How many times the overseer visited certain areas of the property, 3 times daily to the cotton fields during harvest season, once weekly to the far pastures where the old equipment was stored. Sarah didn't just count, she remembered. Every number, every pattern, every deviation from the norm. That girl has her head in the clouds, old Martha would say, watching Sarah stare into the distance while the other children played, always looking at nothing with that thoughtful look on her face, like she's somewhere else entirely. But Sarah's head wasn't in the clouds. She was paying attention. More attention than anyone realized, more attention than would be prudent for someone in her position. She noticed that the overseer, Mr. Stevens, always limped more severely on Thursdays. She'd counted his steps and timed his rounds. Thursday was when he walked the entire property line, nearly 4 miles, checking fences. By evening, his old war injury would be bothering him, and he'd retire early. Thursdays were the safest days for small infractions, though Sarah never shared this observation with anyone. She noticed that Mrs. Vance ordered new fabric every 43 days, like clockwork. She noticed that the cook, old Esther, used exactly 2 handfuls of salt for every large pot of stew, and that when she used 3, it meant someone important was coming to dinner. She noticed that the dogs were restless 2 days before storms, and that the rooster that woke everyone at dawn was silent when frost was coming. Everything had a pattern, everything had a rhythm, and Sarah saw it all. Fairmont Plantation had belonged to the Vance family for 3 generations. The original Vance, Thomas's grandfather, had built the property from nothing in the 1790s, starting with 200 acres and a dozen workers. By the time his son inherited, it had grown to nearly 1,000 acres, with over 100 enslaved people working the cotton fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The current owner, Thomas Vance, had inherited the property at 23, after his father's premature death from a riding accident. That had been in 1836, 7 years ago now. Thomas was tall and thin, with blonde hair that was already thinning despite his relative youth, and pale blue eyes that rarely seemed to focus directly on anyone. He had a reputation throughout the county for being a man of numbers, a detail-oriented proprietor who kept meticulous records of every aspect of his property. Not like his father, Sarah had heard the house servants whisper. Old Mr. Vance ran everything by feel, by instinct. Young Thomas, he writes everything down, counts every seed, measures every bale. Some say he's smart. Others say he doesn't trust his own judgment. The plantation itself was impressive, even Sarah had to admit. The main house was a grand 3-story structure with white columns and a wraparound porch, sitting on a slight hill that overlooked the fields. Behind it were the various outbuildings, the kitchen house, the smokehouse, the laundry, the stables, the carriage house. Further back were the cabins where the field workers lived, arranged in neat rows like soldiers at attention, and beyond those, the endless fields of cotton, white bowls catching the sunlight like snow in autumn. The problem, Sarah had come to understand through whispered conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, was that Thomas Vance had difficulty keeping accountants. The first one, a young man fresh from a Charleston accounting firm, had left after only 6 months, citing health problems. "The climate doesn't agree with me," he'd told Mr. Vance, though the servant said he'd looked terrified when he'd packed his bags, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something terrible to appear. The second accountant, a middle-aged man from Virginia, had stayed a full year before departing abruptly one morning without even collecting his final wages. He'd left a brief note: "I cannot continue in this position. Please send my remaining pay to my family in Richmond." No explanation, no notice, just gone. The third, an elderly man named Herbert Crane, had arrived with the wary look of someone who'd heard the stories but needed the work too desperately to refuse. He'd stayed the longest, nearly 2 years, before dying suddenly one February morning. The doctor said it was his heart, simply gave out in his sleep. But some of the older workers murmured darker speculations late at night, talking about curses and bad luck and debts that followed families through generations. Sarah first saw the office when she was 9 years old, during that brief period between the second accountant's departure and Herbert Crane's arrival. Her mother, Della, had been called to clean the room after the Virginia accountant's sudden exit. Della was trusted in the big house. She'd worked there since she was a girl herself, first in the kitchen, then as a chambermaid, and now as Mrs. Vance's personal attendant. She was quiet, efficient, and knew how to be invisible when necessary, qualities that made her valuable to the Vance family. Sarah had accompanied her that day, as she often did when there were tasks that required an extra pair of hands. At 9 years old, Sarah was considered old enough to help with light work, but not yet old enough to be assigned to the fields or a specific trade. "Don't touch anything," Della had warned as they entered the office, her voice carrying that tone that admitted no disobedience. "Especially not the papers on the desk. Just help me with the dust on the shelves, and we'll be out of here quickly. Mr. Vance is particular about this room." But even as Sarah had nodded obediently, picked up her dusting cloth, and approached the shelves, she couldn't stop her eyes from wandering, couldn't stop her mind from absorbing every detail of this forbidden space. The office was smaller than she'd imagined, perhaps 15 feet square, with a single large window overlooking the front lawn. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with dark wooden shelves, and those shelves were packed with books. Not the kind of books Mrs. Vance kept in the parlor for show, leather-bound volumes of poetry and philosophy that no one ever read. These were working books, practical books, their spines worn from constant use. Ledgers, dozens of them, maybe over 100, each one thick as a Bible, bound in brown or black leather, with years marked on the spines in fading gold letters. 1825, 1830, 1835, 1840. A complete history of Fairmont Plantation, measured in pounds of cotton and dollars earned, all organized chronologically on those shelves. In the center of the room stood a massive oak desk, its surface scarred with years of use. An inkwell sat in one corner, the glass thick with dried black residue. A collection of pens lay scattered across the surface, some with nibs so worn they'd split. And covering nearly every inch of available space were papers, loose sheets covered with neat columns of numbers and words, pages that had been torn from ledgers, notes scrawled in margins, calculations worked out in the spaces between other calculations. It was chaos and order simultaneously, a mess that somehow made sense. A system that looked like disorder to the untrained eye, but clearly had its own internal logic. Sarah had moved closer to the desk, her dusting cloth hanging forgotten in her hand, drawn by those mysterious symbols marching across the pages in perfect rows, numbers. She recognized those, 1, 5, 7, 9. She could count, after all. Everyone could count, at least a little. But these numbers were arranged in ways that suggested meaning beyond simple counting. They were organized into columns with lines drawn between them. They were added together, creating sums at the bottom of pages. They told a story, if only she could read it. And there were other symbols too, curving lines and straight marks that she knew represented words, though she had no idea which words or what they meant. Her mother had told her these were called letters, and that when you put them together in the right order, they made sounds, and the sounds made words, and the words had meaning. Sarah had reached out, her small brown hand hovering inches above a page filled with those mysterious symbols, wanting desperately to touch it, to somehow absorb its secrets through her fingertips. Sarah. Della's voice had cracked like a whip, sharp with fear. Get away from that desk now. Sarah had jumped back as if burned, spinning to face her mother. Della had crossed the room in 3 quick strides and grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her away from the desk. Her grip was tight enough to hurt, her eyes wide with something beyond anger, genuine terror. Do you have any idea what would happen if Mr. Vance came in and saw you touching his private papers? Do you? Della had whispered fiercely, her voice barely above a breath but somehow more forceful than a shout. I'm sorry, Mama. I didn't touch anything, I don't care what you stay away from that desk, away from those papers, away from anything in this room except the dust I told you to wipe. Do you understand me? Sarah had nodded, chastened but not quite repentant. Because even as her mother pulled her away, even as she returned to the safe task of dusting the shelves, her mind was still at that desk, still seeing those numbers and letters, still wondering what secrets they contained. They'd finished the cleaning in silence, and when they'd left, Della had locked the door behind them with the key Mrs. Vance had provided. But it was too late. Sarah had seen. And something inside her, that part that counted and organized and saw patterns in everything, had awakened like a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. That night, lying on her thin mattress of straw in the cabin she shared with her mother and 2 other families, Sarah had taken a small stick and begun drawing in the dirt floor beside her bed. She tried to reproduce the symbols she'd seen. The numbers were easy. She knew those. 1 looked like a straight line. 5 was a line with curves. 7 was an angle. She drew them carefully, checking her memory against each mark in the dirt. But the letters were harder. She'd seen so many of them in so many different combinations. There was one that looked like a circle, that appeared frequently. Another that was like a cross, one that reminded her of a snake. She drew them all, trying to commit them to memory, trying to create some system in her mind to organize and understand them. Sarah, what are you doing? Della's voice had come from the darkness, tired and wary. Nothing, Mama. Stop whatever it is and go to sleep. But Sarah had heard the resignation in her mother's voice, that tone that said Della knew her daughter was doing something she shouldn't, but was too exhausted to fight about it. Mama, Sarah had whispered after a moment, those marks on the papers, in the office, what are they? A long silence. Sarah could hear her mother's breathing in the dark, could sense her internal debate about whether to answer. Finally, with a deep sigh, they're records, Sarah. Numbers that tell how much cotton was planted in each field, how much was harvested, how much was sold and for what price. They track how much money was spent on seeds and tools and... She'd paused. And other things. The numbers tell all that. The numbers and the words together. The words say what the numbers are measuring. Like, the word cotton next to a number tells you that number means pounds of cotton. The word dollars tells you the number means money. Sarah had absorbed this, her mind racing. And the other words? The ones that aren't about cotton or money. Names, places, dates. Everything that happens on a plantation gets written down, Sarah. Everything that matters to the people who own it. There'd been a bitter edge to Della's voice on that last part. Can you read the words, Mama? No. The answer had been sharp, almost violent in its intensity. And you won't learn either. It's forbidden, Sarah, against the law, do you understand? Slaves and people like us, we're not allowed to read or write. If we're caught trying, the punishment is severe. very severe. But why? If it's just marks on paper. Because knowledge is power, Della had interrupted, her voice softer now but no less intense. Because if we could read the newspapers and learn about the world beyond this plantation. We could read the laws and know our rights, the few we have. We could write passes and travel. We could forge documents. We could organize. The people who make the rules know that, Sarah. That's why it's forbidden. Sarah had processed this information in silence. The prohibition made sense, in a terrible sort of way. If reading was powerful enough to be forbidden, then it must be valuable indeed. You're too curious, Della had said quietly. It scares me sometimes, how much you want to know. Curiosity is dangerous for people like us. It draws attention. It makes you dissatisfied. It makes you ask questions that have no good answers. She'd paused. Promise me you'll forget about those papers. Promise me you'll put this out of your mind. I promise, Mama, Sarah had said. But even as the words left her mouth, she'd known it was a lie. She couldn't forget, wouldn't forget. The symbols on those pages had called to something deep inside her, something that needed to understand, to organize, to know. She'd lain awake long after her mother's breathing had deepened into sleep, staring at the rough wooden ceiling of the cabin, her mind full of numbers and letters and questions that had no answers yet. But they would. Somehow, someday, Sarah would find those answers. She just had to be patient, and patient, she was learning, was something she could be when it mattered. The third accountant, Herbert Crane, arrived at Fairmont on a cool October afternoon when Sarah was 10 years old. She'd been in the yard behind the kitchen house, helping to pluck chickens for that evening's dinner, when the carriage had rolled up the long drive. It wasn't Mr. Vance's carriage. That one she would have recognized immediately. This was a hired vehicle from town, dusty from the road, pulled by two tired-looking horses. The driver had climbed down first, then opened the door for the passenger. Herbert Crane had emerged slowly, carefully, like a man who'd learned not to trust his own body. He was old, truly old, not just middle-aged like Mr. Vance, but genuinely elderly. Sarah guessed he must be past 70. His face was deeply lined, like leather left too long in the sun, and his hair was white and sparse, revealing patches of age-spotted scalp. He wore spectacles with thick lenses that magnified his pale blue eyes, making him look perpetually startled. But it was his hands that drew Sarah's attention. They trembled constantly, a fine shake that made him fumble with his walking stick as he steadied himself against the carriage. When he reached back inside to retrieve his bag, she could see the effort it cost him just to maintain his grip. Mr. Vance had come out to greet him, and Sarah had watched the exchange from her position at the plucking table, her hands automatically continuing to work while her attention was focused entirely on the two men. Mr. Crane, welcome to Fairmont. Mr. Vance's voice had carried across the yard, professionally friendly, but with an undertone of desperation. This was his fourth accountant in 7 years, after all. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous. Long, Mr. Vance, but not unbearable. Herbert's voice was surprisingly strong for such a frail-looking man, cultured and precise. Your directions were excellent. Let me help you with your bag. I can manage, thank you. Herbert had hefted the worn leather case himself, though Sarah could see it was heavy, and his arms shook with the effort. I may be old, sir, but I'm not yet helpless. Of course, of course. Well, let me show you to your quarters. I've had the clerk's cottage prepared for you. It's modest but private and close to the office for convenience. They'd walked toward the back of the property, Mr. Vance matching his pace to Herbert's slow, careful steps. Sarah had watched them go, noting the way Herbert paused every dozen steps to catch his breath, the way he leaned heavily on his walking stick, the way Mr. Vance hovered nearby like he expected the old man to collapse at any moment. That one won't last 6 months. Esther had muttered from her position at the kitchen door, where she'd also been watching. Too old, too frail. This place eats accountants alive, and that one's already half gone. But Esther, Sarah would learn, was wrong. Herbert Crane had a core of steel beneath that fragile exterior. The Clark's cottage was a small building at the edge of the main property, tucked between the big house and the working areas of the plantation. It had 2 rooms, a bedroom and a sitting room that could double as a study, and a small covered porch. It was traditionally reserved for trusted employees who weren't family, but ranked above the common workers. Previous accountants, the plantation's doctor during his brief tenures, once even a tutor Mr. Vance had hired for a year before deciding formal education wasn't worth the expense. Sarah had learned all this from listening to conversations, from piecing together fragments of information over years of quiet observation. She'd never been inside the cottage herself. There'd been no reason to. But she knew its layout, knew that it had a stone chimney on the north wall and 2 windows facing east toward the rising sun. It was 3 days after Herbert Crane's arrival that old Martha took ill. Martha was ancient, well past 80 by her own accounting, and had been at Fairmont longer than anyone could remember. She'd raised 2 generations of Vances, including Mr. Thomas's father, and in her old age had been relegated to light duties, supervising the youngest children, doing simple mending, occasionally carrying messages or meals to workers in the outer buildings. Her legs had been bothering her for months, swelling up like tree trunks by evening, making each step painful. Della had tried to help with compresses and elevation, but age was age, and Martha's body was simply wearing out. When she finally couldn't walk at all, confined to her bed in the cabin she shared with her daughter and grandchildren, someone had to take over her duties. "Sarah can handle it," Della had suggested to Mrs. Vance during one of their morning conferences, where the day's tasks were discussed and distributed. "She's responsible, discreet, and knows how to move quietly. Martha's duties aren't difficult, just time-consuming." Mrs. Vance had considered this, her sharp eyes evaluating Sarah, who stood quietly in the corner of the room as she often did when accompanying her mother. "She's rather young," Mrs. Vance had said. "What is she, 9? 10, ma'am. Old enough to be trustworthy. Very well. She can take over the meal deliveries and the message running. But make sure she understands the importance of discretion. Mr. Crane is to be treated with respect and given privacy. I don't want him bothered." "Yes, ma'am. Sarah understands." And so Sarah found herself, twice daily, walking to the clerk's cottage with a tray of food for Herbert Crane. The first few times she'd simply knocked, waited for his call to enter, deposited the tray on the small table just inside the door, bobbed a quick curtsy, and left. The entire interaction took less than a minute. Herbert would nod his thanks, sometimes say, "Much appreciated," and return his attention to whatever he'd been doing. Usually reading, Sarah noticed. Always reading. Not ledgers, but books. Real books with proper bindings and printed pages. But on the 4th day, as Sarah was setting down his dinner tray, Herbert had spoken. "You're Della's girl, aren't you?" Sarah had paused, surprised at being directly addressed. "Yes, sir. She's an excellent worker, your mother. Very thorough, very discreet." "Thank you, sir." Sarah had turned to go. "Wait a moment." Herbert had set down his book, removing his spectacles to clean them with a handkerchief. "What's your name?" "Sarah, sir." "Sarah. A good biblical name. Do you know the story of Sarah from the Bible?" "No, sir." It was true. The enslaved workers at Fairmont weren't taught scripture beyond what they heard at the Sunday gatherings led by Mr. Vance himself, and those focused on themes of obedience and accepting one's place in God's plan. She was the wife of Abraham, waited many years for a son, then finally had one when she was very old. Patience rewarded, you might say. He'd settled the spectacles back on his nose. "Tell me, Sarah, can you count?" The question had seemed innocent enough, but Sarah had hesitated anyway. There was something in his tone, some undercurrent of real interest, that made her wary. "A little, sir." "How much is a little? To 10? 20? Sarah had made a quick calculation. Admitting she could count to 100 might raise questions about how she'd learned, but claiming too little would make her seem stupid, and she had a feeling Herbert wasn't a man who suffered fools. "To 50, sir, maybe a bit more." Herbert's eyebrows had risen slightly. "Indeed? And who taught you?" "No one taught me, sir. I just picked it up." "Counting eggs? Counting children when watching them, counting steps when walking places. Numbers just sort of make sense to me. Makes sense to you, Herbert had repeated, studying her with those magnified eyes. Interesting phrase. Most people would say they learned to count. You say numbers make sense. There's a difference. Sarah had said nothing, sensing that silence was safer than explanation. Well, Sarah, who counts to 50, thank you for bringing my dinner. You may go. She'd curtsied and left, feeling his gaze on her back until the door closed between them. Over the following days, the conversations had continued, growing gradually longer. Herbert seemed lonely, eager for some interaction beyond the curt professional exchanges he had with Mr. Vance. And Sarah, despite her caution, found herself drawn to the old man's obvious intelligence, his careful way of speaking, the kindness in his voice when he thanked her for each delivery. He'd begun asking her questions, simple ones at first. How many glasses of water do you bring me in the morning? 2, sir. And if I asked for 4, how many more would that be? 2 more, sir. If you brought 2 glasses twice a day for 7 days, how many total would that be? Sarah had calculated quickly. 28, sir. Correct. You're quick with mental arithmetic. Then the questions had grown more complex. It takes you approximately 4 minutes to walk from the kitchen to my cottage. How many times would you have to make that walk to equal an hour? Sarah had thought about it. 15 times, sir. Show me your reasoning. Well, an hour is 60 minutes. 60 divided by 4 is 15. Herbert had smiled. You understand division. I understand that if you split something into equal parts, you can figure out how many parts you have. Yes, sir. Did someone teach you division? No, sir, it's just logical. If I have 12 children to watch and need to split them into groups of 3 for a game, I know I'll have 4 groups. That's division, isn't it? It is indeed. Herbert had looked at her for a long moment. You have a natural gift for numbers, Sarah. A genuine mathematical mind. That's quite rare, even among those who receive formal education. Sarah had felt a warmth at the praise, even as she'd known she should be careful about showing too much ability. The turning point had come 3 weeks after Herbert's arrival. It was a moonless night, overcast and dark as pitch. Sarah had delivered Herbert's evening meal at the usual time, just after sunset, and had returned to her cabin expecting to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was too active, full of the number problems Herbert had been giving her, full of questions about the symbols she'd seen in the office so long ago, full of a restless hunger for something she couldn't name. Finally, unable to lie still any longer, she'd risen and slipped outside. The plantation was quiet, most everyone asleep except for the occasional dog barking in the distance. Sarah had walked without direction, just needing to move, and had found her feet carrying her toward the Clark's cottage. A faint light glowed in the window. Herbert was still awake. Sarah had stood in the darkness, watching the play of candlelight against the curtains, wondering what the old man was doing. Reading, probably. He was always reading. If you're going to lurk outside, you might as well come in. Herbert's voice had come from the half-open window, making Sarah jump. She'd frozen, caught, unsure whether to run or respond. I won't tell anyone, Herbert had continued, his voice gentle. I just saw a shadow pass by the window and recognized your height. Come in, Sarah. I want to talk to you. Slowly, heart pounding, Sarah had approached the door. It opened before she could knock, and Herbert stood there in his nightshirt and robe, a candle in one trembling hand. Come in quickly before someone sees. Inside, the cottage was warm and close, heated by a small fire in the hearth. Books were piled on every surface. The table, the chairs, the floor beside the bed. More books than Sarah had ever seen in one place outside of Mr. Vance's office. Herbert had gestured to a chair. Sit. Sarah had perched on the edge of the seat, ready to flee if necessary. I've been observing you, Herbert had said, settling into his own chair with a slight groan. These past 3 weeks, you're not just intelligent, Sarah. You're exceptional. The speed with which you solve mental arithmetic, the way you intuitively grasp mathematical concepts without formal instruction. I've been an accountant for 50 years, and I've met perhaps 3 people with your natural aptitude." Sarah had said nothing, unsure where this was leading. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer. Can you give me that?" "I'll try, sir." "Do you want to learn? Really learn? Not just pick up fragments here and there, but truly understand numbers and letters and how they work together to record and communicate information?" The question had hung in the air between them, huge and dangerous and thrilling. "Yes," Sarah had whispered. "More than anything." Herbert had nodded slowly. "I thought so. I see it in your eyes every time I give you a problem to solve. That hunger. I had a daughter once who looked at books the same way." His voice had grown distant. "Clara. She died young, 15 years old. I'm sorry, sir. It was a long time ago, nearly 40 years now, but I've never forgotten the waste of it. She was brilliant, Sarah. Brilliant in a way the world had no use for, because she was female and poor. I couldn't afford to educate her, couldn't even teach her myself because I was too busy trying to earn enough money to keep us fed. And then she was gone, and all that potential went with her into the grave." He'd looked directly at Sarah, his magnified eyes intense behind the thick lenses. "I'm an old man. I have, at best, a few years left, probably less, and I find myself with an opportunity to do something I failed to do 40 years ago, to teach someone with a genuine gift, someone who deserves an education even if the world says otherwise. Sir, I don't understand. I want to teach you, Sarah, reading, writing, arithmetic, accounting, everything I know, but you must understand what this means. If we're discovered, you'll be punished severely. Whipped, possibly sold away from your mother, possibly worse. And I'll be dismissed, probably face legal charges. It's a serious crime in South Carolina to teach an enslaved person to read." "I know, sir. My mother told me. And yet I can see in your face that you're going to say yes anyway." Sarah had taken a deep breath. "My mother says curiosity brings trouble. But I can't help being curious, sir. I can't help wanting to know. And if the knowing itself is trouble, then I'm already in it, because I can't stop wondering about those marks on paper, about what they mean and how they work and what secrets they're hiding." Herbert had smiled, a sad, understanding smile. "Then we're both fools, you and I. But at least we'll be fools with purpose." He'd extended his trembling hand. "Do we have an agreement? You'll be my student, in absolute secrecy, for as long as I'm able to teach." Sarah had clasped his hand, feeling the fragile bones beneath papery skin, feeling the tremor that never stopped. "Yes, sir. We have an agreement." And so, in a small cottage on a dark night, Sarah's education had begun. The lessons followed a strict schedule, one born of necessity and designed to avoid detection. Sarah would come to the cottage late at night, never at the same time, never following the same path twice in a row. Sometimes she'd arrive around midnight when the moon was high. Other times she'd wait until the darkest hours before dawn, when even the most wakeful souls were in their deepest sleep. Herbert would be waiting, always awake despite the hour. Sarah suspected the old man slept very little anyway, his body too worn and painful to allow much rest. They'd keep the curtains drawn tight, work by a single candle placed low on the table so its light wouldn't be visible from outside. And Herbert would teach. He'd started with numbers, not because Sarah didn't already understand counting, but because numbers were foundational to everything else he wanted to teach her. "You can count," he'd said that first night, spreading a sheet of paper before her. "But can you read a number when it's written? Can you write one yourself?" He'd shown her how the symbols worked. How 1 was a single stroke, simple and clear. How 2 curved like a swan's neck. How each digit from 0 to 9 had its own distinct shape, and how combining them created any number imaginable. Sarah had practiced writing them, using a slate and chalk, so there'd be no permanent record. Her first attempts had been shaky, the proportions wrong, but Herbert had been patient. "Again," he'd say, "make the curve of the 5 more pronounced. The top of the 7 should be straight, not curved." After the individual digits came the concept of place value, ones, tens, hundreds, thousands. how the position of a digit determined its value. If I write 23, what does that mean? 2 10s and 3 1s. Sarah had answered, 23. And if I write 230, 200s, 3 10s, no 1s, 230. Excellent. You see the pattern. Now what if I write 2,300? Sarah had thought about it. 2,000s, 300s, no 10s, no 1s. Correct. The comma is just there to make large numbers easier to read. It separates the thousands from the hundreds. Now let's talk about addition. They'd worked through basic arithmetic first. Addition and subtraction, concepts Sarah already understood, but had never seen written down. Herbert showed her how to stack numbers vertically, how to carry digits when sums exceeded 9, how to borrow when subtracting larger numbers from smaller ones. Then multiplication and division, which took longer because the concepts were more abstract. But Sarah had a knack for seeing the patterns, for understanding the relationships between numbers. Multiplication is just repeated addition, Herbert had explained. If I want to know what 7 times 4 equals, I'm really asking, what do I get if I add 7 to itself 4 times? Sarah had calculated in her head. 28. Right. And division is the reverse. If I have 28 and I divide it by 7, I'm asking, how many groups of 7 can I make from 28? 4 groups. Exactly. You're a natural at this, Sarah. Truly natural. After numbers came letters. This was harder because, unlike numbers, which followed logical mathematical rules, letters were arbitrary symbols representing arbitrary sounds. There was no inherent reason why the shape A should make the sound A. It just did, because people had agreed it did. But Herbert made it systematic, starting with the alphabet itself. 26 letters, each with 2 forms, capital and lowercase, each with its own sound, though sometimes letters made different sounds depending on what other letters were near them. Sarah had memorized the alphabet in 3 nights, writing each letter over and over on her slate until the shapes were burned into her memory. Then came the real challenge, putting letters together to make words. This is C-A-T, Herbert had written. Cat. The C makes a K sound, the A makes an R sound, the T makes a T sound. Put them together, Ku-a-tu, cat. Sarah had sounded it out, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. Now try this one, D-O-G. D-O-G, dog. Very good, you're getting it. Night after night they'd worked through simple words, 3-letter words first, then 4, then 5. Herbert would write them out, Sarah would sound them out, and slowly, painfully slowly, she began to understand how the written language worked. Reading came before writing, simply because reading was less risky. Sarah couldn't carry papers with her own handwriting back to her cabin. If they were discovered, there'd be no explanation possible. But she could practice reading Herbert's writing or the printed words in his books, and carry that knowledge safely in her mind. Writing would come later, once the reading was solid. Della knew what was happening. She had to know. Sarah was gone for hours each night, returning just before dawn with exhaustion written in every line of her young face. But her mother never directly confronted her, never demanded she stop. Instead, Della covered for her. When others noticed Sarah looked tired, Della would say her daughter had been up helping with a sick child. When someone commented on Sarah's unusual schedule, Della would create excuses about extra duties Mrs. Vance had assigned. It was a silent acceptance, born perhaps from Della's own frustrated dreams, her own secret wish that she'd had the chance to learn what her daughter was learning now. But sometimes, late at night when Sarah would finally collapse onto her mattress, Della would whisper warnings into the darkness. Be careful. I am, Mama. Be more careful than you think you need to be. If they catch you, they won't. If they do, I can't protect you. Do you understand that? There are some things I can't save you from. I understand. And Sarah did understand. She knew the risk she was taking. Knew that in South Carolina in 1841, teaching an enslaved person to read was a criminal offense, punishable by fines and imprisonment for the teacher and brutal corporal punishment for the student. She knew that if discovered, she could be whipped until her back was shredded, could be sold away to the deep South where cotton plantations worked people to death in the fields, could be made an example of to frighten others away from similar ambitions. She knew all of this, and still she went to Herbert's cottage night after night, because the hunger in her mind was stronger than fear. By her 11th birthday, Sarah could read simple sentences. By the time she turned 12, she could read almost anything Herbert put in front of her, sounding out unfamiliar words, deducing meaning from context. And that's when Herbert brought her to the office. The office visit happened on a Sunday morning when Mr. Vance was away visiting his sister in Beaufort, a trip he made quarterly and which always lasted 2 days. Herbert had sent word through Sarah that he needed help organizing some papers. It was plausible enough. Everyone knew his hands shook terribly, making detailed work difficult. Mrs. Vance had approved Sarah's temporary reassignment without question. Sarah had knocked on the office door at precisely 9 o'clock, as instructed. "Come in." The room looked different than it had 3 years ago when she'd first glimpsed it. Or perhaps Sarah was different and saw it with new eyes. The shelves of ledgers were no longer mysterious volumes, but records she could potentially read. The papers on the desk were no longer random symbols, but information, knowledge, truth waiting to be understood. Herbert was seated at the desk, a ledger open before him. "Close the door," he'd said quietly. Sarah had obeyed, her heart racing. "Today you're going to learn what all your education has been for. You're going to understand how a plantation like Fairmont functions as told through its financial records." He'd patted the chair beside him. Sarah had sat, leaning close to see the page. "This is a ledger," Herbert had begun, though Sarah already knew that. "Specifically, this is Fairmont's ledger for the current year, 1843. Every transaction that occurs on this plantation is recorded here. Every purchase, every sale, every expense, every profit. This book is the truth of Fairmont, more honest than any words ever spoken in that big house." His finger, trembling slightly, had traced down a column. "See here? This entry says, March 15th, 1843, cottonseed, 200 pounds, $40. That means on March 15th, Mr. Vance purchased 200 pounds of cottonseed for $40. Sarah had followed his finger, seeing how the date was written first, then the item, then the quantity, then the price. And this one, April 3rd, 1843, field tools assorted $75. More tools purchased. He'd flipped to another section. "This is the sales ledger here. October 1st, 1843, cotton, 1,000 bales, $50,000. That was Fairmont's cotton crop last year. 1,000 bales sold for $50,000. The numbers were staggering. Sarah had no real concept of what $50,000 meant, but she understood it was an enormous sum. "Now this is where it gets interesting," Herbert had said, moving to a different page. "This is the expense ledger. Here we track everything spent. Seeds, tools, repairs, cloth for clothing, food for the quarters, everything. If I add up all the expenses for last year," he'd shown her a sum at the bottom of a page, $23,000 in total expenses. Sarah had done the math automatically. "So the profit was $27,000. "Not quite. You're forgetting debt service. See this entry? Bank payment, $12,000. That's the annual payment on the mortgage Mr. Vance's father took out years ago, so the actual profit was $15,000 in a single year. To Sarah, who'd never possessed a single dollar in her life, the number was almost incomprehensible. "Now let me show you something else, something darker." Herbert had pulled out a different ledger, this one older, from 1840. "This," he'd said, his voice heavy, "is the human property ledger." He'd opened it to a page filled with names. Names Sarah recognized, people she knew. Her own mother's name was there. Della, age 32, house servant, estimated value $900. And below it, Sarah, age 9, potential house servant, estimated value $600. Sarah had stared at the entry, seeing her own life reduced to a line in a book, her worth calculated like a tool or a horse. "This is how they see us," Herbert had said quietly, "as assets, as property with monetary value. Your worth isn't in your intelligence or your character or your potential. It's in the labor you can provide and the price you might bring at auction." He'd let that sink in, then continued. "Every enslaved person on this plantation is listed here. Births are recorded as increases in property. Deaths are recorded as losses. Sales and purchases are tracked meticulously." Sarah had scanned the pages, seeing the names of people she'd known who were no longer at Fairmont. Marcus, age 24, field hand, sold to J. Patterson, $2,200. Betty, age 45, cook, deceased May 1840, loss of $400. Each line was a life interrupted, a story ended or changed, all reduced to numbers in a ledger. "Why are you showing me this?" Sarah had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you need to understand what these records really are. They're not just business documents. They're a chronicle of injustice, written in numbers that can't lie even when the people who make them want to hide the truth." He'd looked at her seriously. "And because soon, I'm going to need your help maintaining them." Sarah had torn her gaze from the ledgers to stare at Herbert. "Sir, my hands are getting worse. Some days I can barely hold a pen. I've hidden it from Mr. Vance as best I can, but he's not blind. He sees me struggling." Herbert had held up his trembling hands as if in evidence. "I need someone who can write for me, who can keep the records when my body won't cooperate. Someone I can trust, someone who's smart enough to understand the work. You want me to be your assistant? To actually help with the bookkeeping? More than an assistant. I want to teach you everything, train you completely, so that when I'm gone, and I will be gone soon, Sarah, my heart isn't strong, you can take over." "Mr. Vance would never allow that. I'm enslaved, a child, a girl." Herbert had finished. "Yes, all true, all obstacles, but consider this. Mr. Vance is desperate. He's had 4 accountants in 7 years. My predecessor died in this very office, and the one before that fled in the night. Accountants are starting to refuse this position. They think it's cursed, or that Vance is impossible to work for, or both." "Is he impossible to work for?" "No more than any other wealthy man used to getting his way. The problem isn't Vance. The problem is—" He'd paused, considering his words. "The records are complex. Fairmont is a large operation with many moving parts, and there are irregularities. Things that don't quite add up. Things that might disturb someone who looks too closely." "What kind of irregularities?" "That's what I need you to help me discover. But first you need to learn the system. Learn it so well you can maintain it in your sleep. Can you do that?" Sarah had looked around the office, at the rows of ledgers, at the desk covered in papers, at the window overlooking the plantation grounds. This was power. Hidden power, invisible power, but power nonetheless. The person who kept the records, who knew where the money came from and where it went, who understood the numbers that made Fairmont function. That person had knowledge others didn't. And knowledge, as her mother had said, was power. "Yes," Sarah had said, "teach me everything." Over the next 6 months, Sarah became intimately familiar with every aspect of Fairmont's bookkeeping system. She learned Herbert's filing method, how he cross-referenced entries between different ledgers, how a cotton sale would be recorded in the sales ledger, with a matching entry in the cash ledger showing payment received, and another entry in the inventory ledger showing the depletion of stored bales. She learned the calendar of the plantation, planting season in March and April, growing season through the summer, harvest in September and October, selling in November and December, winter months for repairs and planning. She learned how to calculate depreciation on equipment, how to estimate the value of growing crops, how to project next year's expenses based on current trends. And Herbert taught her to write in the ledgers themselves. This was terrifying at first. The permanence of ink, the importance of accuracy, the knowledge that these records could be examined by Mr. Vance, or by bank auditors, or by potential buyers. One mistake could reveal her involvement. But Herbert was a patient teacher, and Sarah had excellent penmanship. She practiced on scrap paper first, learning to mimic Herbert's own handwriting so closely that their entries would be indistinguishable. Then she graduated to making actual entries in the current ledger, always under Herbert's supervision, always double-checked before the ink dried. "Excellent," Herbert would say, examining her work through his thick spectacles. "I can barely tell which entries are mine and which are yours." The work became routine. Sarah would come to the office on Sunday mornings when the family was at church services in town. Herbert, claiming poor health, was excused from attending. They'd work for several hours, updating ledgers, filing receipts, preparing reports. And as Sarah worked, she began to notice things. Small discrepancies at first, numbers that didn't quite match across different ledgers, entries that seemed out of place. "Mr. Crane," she'd said one Sunday, pointing to a line in the expense ledger from 2 years prior. "This entry says 15 plows were purchased in March of 1841. Price paid was $750. Yes, I remember that purchase. But look here in the sales ledger from last month. It says 10 used plows were sold to the Patterson Plantation for $300. That's correct. Old equipment that was being replaced. So we should still have 5 of the plows purchased in 1841, yes? The 15 we bought, minus the 10 we sold, leaves 5. In theory, yes. But according to the current inventory list, we only have 2 plows total on the property. What happened to the other 3? Herbert had frowned, checking the numbers himself. That's odd. They could have broken, I suppose, or been scrapped. But wouldn't that be recorded somewhere? You said everything gets recorded. Everything should be recorded, yes. But sometimes things fall through the cracks. Equipment breaks in the field and gets disposed of without anyone telling me. But Sarah's mind was already moving, seeing patterns. She began looking for other discrepancies. She found them. Tools purchased that never appeared in inventory lists. Cloth bought for worker clothing that, when Sarah did a head count and estimated yards needed per person, should have been far more than was actually required. Food supplies ordered weekly that should have lasted months, based on the number of people being fed. And stranger still, there were entries that looked wrong. Numbers that appeared to have been written over, where the ink was slightly thicker or a different shade, as if the page had been altered after the fact. Someone is stealing, Sarah had concluded after weeks of careful analysis. Or the records are being changed to hide something. Herbert had looked troubled. "That's a serious accusation, Sarah." "I know, sir. But look at the patterns. Over the past 3 years, there's been a consistent shortage of about 15 to 20% on all supplies and equipment purchases. It's hidden because each individual discrepancy is small, but when you add them all together..." How much? Sarah had calculated in her head, cross-referencing multiple ledgers. At least $3,000, maybe more. $3,000. A fortune being siphoned away from Fairmont's operations, hidden in a pattern of small thefts and altered records. "Who has access to the accounts?" Sarah had asked. "Myself, obviously. Mr. Vance reviews them regularly, and his business manager, Crawford, approves all purchases and deliveries." Crawford, Sarah had repeated. The name meant nothing to her. She'd seen him around the plantation, a middle-aged man with a neat beard and an air of self-importance, but had never spoken to him. "He's been Mr. Vance's manager for 4 years now?" "Yes, he was hired in early 1840. Sarah had pulled out the ledgers from 1839 and compared them to those from 1841. The discrepancies began appearing in late 1840, about 6 months after Crawford's arrival. "It's him," she'd said with certainty. "Crawford is stealing from Mr. Vance." Herbert had rubbed his forehead, looking suddenly very old and very tired. If you're right, and I suspect you are, this is extremely dangerous knowledge, Sarah. Shouldn't we tell Mr. Vance? And say what? That a 12-year-old enslaved girl who isn't supposed to be literate has been studying his confidential business records and discovered a pattern of embezzlement? Think about what that means, Sarah. We'd both be punished, severely, and Mr. Vance still might not believe us. So we do nothing, let Crawford keep stealing. No, we wait for the right moment, we gather undeniable evidence. And when I can present it as my own discovery, when I can position you as my trained assistant rather than an impossible anomaly, then we act. He'd placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. Patience, Sarah. Patience and careful planning. That's how we'll handle this. But patience, it turned out, was something they didn't have much of. Herbert Crane died on a bitter cold morning in February 1844, 2 months after his 73rd birthday. Sarah found him when she brought his morning water at 6 o'clock, as she did every day. The door was unlocked, which was unusual. Herbert was always careful about locks, especially when Sarah was coming and going at odd hours. "Mr. Crane," she'd called softly, pushing the door open. No response. The sitting room was cold, the fire having burned down to ash hours ago. Through the doorway to the bedroom, Sarah could see Herbert's form in the chair by the window, motionless. She'd approached slowly, some part of her already knowing what she'd find, but refusing to accept it. Herbert sat with a ledger open on his lap, his spectacles askew on his nose, his eyes closed. His face was peaceful, almost serene, like he'd simply drifted off while reading. But when Sarah touched his hand to wake him, the flesh was cold. He'd been dead for hours. Sarah stood there for a long moment, holding the pitcher of water, feeling something fundamental crack inside her. Herbert had been more than a teacher. He'd been the only person besides her mother who'd ever looked at Sarah and seen a complete human being. Someone with value beyond labor, someone with potential, someone worth investing in. And now he was gone. Eventually, practical necessity overcame grief. Sarah set down the pitcher and looked at what Herbert had been reading. It was the current year's ledger, open to recent entries. Several purchases had been circled in pencil, all of them signed off by Crawford, all of them showing the same pattern of inflation Sarah had identified months ago. At the bottom of the page, in Herbert's increasingly shaky handwriting, were 2 words: "Show Vance." Herbert had known he was dying, had known he might not have much time, and he'd left Sarah instructions for what to do next. She'd carefully removed a blank page from the back of the ledger and copied the circled entries, duplicating Herbert's notes. Then she'd hidden the paper in the waistband of her dress, smoothed her expression into something appropriately distressed, and gone to raise the alarm. The household had responded as expected. Mrs. Vance came to verify the death. A messenger was sent to fetch Mr. Vance from wherever he was on the property. The doctor was summoned, though there was clearly nothing he could do. Sarah had stood in the background as they removed Herbert's body, as they inventoried his possessions, few, as they made arrangements for burial, simple. Mr. Vance had been upset in the distant way of a man who'd lost a useful employee, but not a friend. "Another dead accountant," he'd muttered to his wife. "People are going to think this position really is cursed." The funeral was held 2 days later, in the small cemetery behind the church, where the Vance family and their trusted servants were buried. Herbert had no family to notify, no one to mourn him except Sarah, who stood at the back of the small gathering and silently said goodbye to the man who'd changed her life. As they lowered the simple pine coffin into the ground, Sarah made a promise. She'd use what Herbert had taught her. She'd make his last instruction count. She'd find a way to expose Crawford's theft and prove that Herbert's final act had been to protect Mr. Vance's interests. It was the least she could do for the man who'd given her the gift of knowledge. After the funeral, Sarah had expected Mr. Vance to immediately begin searching for a new accountant. Instead, days passed, then a week, then 2 weeks. The office remained locked. The ledgers went untouched. Current transactions were piling up without being recorded. Sarah learned why when she overheard a conversation in the big house. Mr. Vance was in his study with his wife, discussing the situation in tones loud enough to carry into the hallway where Sarah was pretending to dust. "No one will take the position, Margaret. I've written to every accounting firm in Charleston, every independent bookkeeper within 50 miles. They've all heard about Fairmont. 3 accountants in 6 years, 2 left abruptly, 1 died. They think there's something wrong here." "Is there?" Mrs. Vance had asked. "Something wrong, I mean?" "Of course not. The issue is simply, the work is complex, and some men aren't up to the challenge. But now they're spreading rumors, saying the position is cursed, or that I'm an impossible employer, or God knows what else. So what will you do? You can't manage the books yourself. I'll have to go to Charleston personally, find someone there, someone who hasn't heard the stories. But that could take weeks, Margaret. Months, possibly. And we're in the middle of planting season. Orders are being placed, deliveries are arriving, sales are being finalized. All of it needs to be recorded properly, or come tax time we'll be in chaos. Surely someone local could handle it temporarily, just the basic record keeping until you find a proper accountant?" "Who?" "I need someone with mathematical skills, someone trustworthy, someone who understands how a plantation operates. Those qualifications aren't exactly common." This was Sarah's moment. This was what Herbert had prepared her for. That evening, as Mr. Vance sat on the back porch reviewing some shipping documents and nursing a glass of whiskey, Sarah approached. She'd thought carefully about how to do this. She couldn't simply announce that she was capable of keeping the books. That would raise too many questions. She needed to offer proof first, evidence that would overcome Mr. Vance's inevitable skepticism. "Excuse me, Mr. Vance, sir." He'd looked up, clearly surprised to be approached directly by a slave, especially a young girl. "What is it?" "I have something for you, sir, from Mr. Crane. He asked me to give it to you if anything happened to him." That part was true, even if Herbert hadn't explicitly said it in words. Sarah had handed him the paper with the copied entries. Mr. Vance had frowned, unfolding it. "What is this?" "Records, sir. Mr. Crane was worried about some discrepancies. He asked me to make sure you saw them." "Discrepancies? What kind of discrepancies?" And Sarah had explained. Carefully, using the simplest language possible, she'd shown him how the purchasing records didn't match the inventory, how the numbers had been altered, how the pattern suggested systematic theft. Mr. Vance had listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest to concern. "These are serious allegations," he'd said when she finished. "How did Mr. Crane discover this? And more importantly, how do you know about it?" "He taught me, sir." His hands were failing. The shaking got so bad he couldn't write properly. "So he trained me to help him, to copy entries, to organize papers, to check his arithmetic. He said I had a gift for numbers. He taught you." An old accountant taught a slave girl to do bookkeeping. Mr. Vance's tone was flat, impossible to read. "Yes, sir. Just simple tasks at first. Copying, adding columns. But over time I learned more. I learned how the system works, how to maintain the ledgers, how to spot errors." "Show me." It wasn't a request. "Mr." Vance had stood and walked to the office, unlocking the door for the first time since Herbert's death. Sarah had followed, her heart pounding. Inside, he'd pulled down a ledger at random and opened it. "Tell me what this page shows." Sarah had studied it for only a moment before answering. September 1842 sales. 750 bales of cotton sold to Anderson & Sons in Charleston for $37,500. Payment received October 15, 1842, recorded here in the cash ledger. Add these numbers. He'd pointed to a column of expenses. Sarah had scanned the column and calculated in her head. $2,342. Mr. Vance had used paper and pen to check her math. Correct. He'd given her several more problems, each more complex than the last. Sarah had answered them all perfectly. Finally, Mr. Vance had set down his pen and looked at her with an expression somewhere between amazement and calculation. "This is remarkable, highly irregular, possibly illegal, but remarkable nonetheless. Yes, sir. And you say you can maintain the current ledgers, keep the records up to date until I can hire a proper accountant? I can, sir. Mr. Crane taught me the complete system. Mr. Vance had been silent for a long moment, clearly weighing options. Here's the situation, he'd finally said. I need someone to manage these records immediately. But I cannot, under any circumstances, acknowledge publicly that an enslaved child is doing my bookkeeping. Do you understand? If word got out, I'd be ruined. My creditors wouldn't trust the accounts. My business partners would question my judgment, and I'd face legal troubles for having you educated. I understand, sir. So here's what will happen. Officially, I'm managing the ledgers myself. You will come to this office before dawn each morning and after dark each evening. No one can see you entering or leaving. You'll keep the records perfect, catch any errors, prepare reports for me to present as my own work. In exchange, he'd paused, considering. In exchange, you and your mother will receive better quarters, better food, and my protection from anyone who might cause you trouble. Do we have an agreement? It wasn't freedom. It wasn't even public acknowledgement. But it was survival, and safety, and the chance to continue doing the work she'd come to love. Yes, sir. We have an agreement. Good. Now these discrepancies you mentioned. The ones Mr. Crane was concerned about. How certain are you that someone is stealing? Very certain, sir. The pattern is consistent across 2 years of records. And the person responsible? The entries are all signed by Mr. Crawford, sir. Mr. Vance's expression had darkened. I see. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. You may go. Return tomorrow at 5 in the morning. The door will be unlocked. Sarah had curtsied and left, feeling the weight of what she'd just committed to. She was now the secret accountant of Fairmont Plantation, a 12-year-old enslaved girl, maintaining the financial records of a 1,000-acre property. Herbert would have been proud and terrified, probably both. 3 days after Sarah's conversation with Mr. Vance, Crawford was dismissed. The official reason given was a difference in business philosophy, but the timing told Sarah everything. Mr. Vance had investigated her claims, found them accurate, and removed the thief from his position. A new manager was hired within the week, a young man named Robert Gray from Virginia, with impeccable references and no apparent desire to embezzle from his employer. And Sarah began her double life. She woke each morning at 4:30 while the world was still dark and silent. She'd dress quietly, careful not to wake her mother, though Della was always awake, silently watching her daughter leave, and make her way through the pre-dawn darkness to the office. The door would be unlocked as Mr. Vance had promised. Inside, she'd light a single candle and get to work. The previous day's transactions would be waiting for her in a folder on the desk. Receipts, bills of sale, payment records, all the paperwork that needed to be entered into the ledgers. Sarah would process them methodically, recording each transaction in the appropriate books, cross-referencing between ledgers, ensuring everything balanced. She worked quickly and accurately, her mind thriving on the precision required. Each number had to be exactly right. Each entry had to be perfectly legible. There was no room for error in this work, no possibility of correction without obvious evidence of change. By 6:30, she'd be finished and gone, slipping back to the quarters before the workday officially began. She'd return to her cabin, help her mother with whatever morning tasks needed doing, and then report for her official duties, still helping in the big house, still maintaining the appearance of being a simple servant girl. In the evenings, the process repeated. After dinner was served and the family had retired, Sarah would return to the office. More entries to record, reports to prepare, ledgers to balance. Sometimes Mr. Vance would be there, reviewing her work, asking questions about specific entries. Why did you categorize this expense as tools rather than equipment? Tools are items under $50 that need regular replacement, sir. Equipment is larger purchases over $50 with longer lifespans. Mr. Crane's system made that distinction for depreciation calculation purposes. I see. And this calculation here? That's the projected cotton yield for the South 40 acres, based on the previous 3 years' averages adjusted for this year's rainfall totals. You tracked rainfall? Mr. Crane did, sir. There's a correlation between spring rainfall and harvest yields. Approximately 1 inch of rain above average translates to an additional 10 pounds per acre. Mr. Vance had stared at her. You're frighteningly good at this. It wasn't quite a compliment, more an observation tinged with unease. But Sarah had accepted it as such. The work was exhausting. 4 to 5 hours of intense mental concentration daily on top of her regular duties. But it was also exhilarating. In the office, surrounded by ledgers and numbers, Sarah had a kind of power she'd never experienced before. She knew things, important things, secret things. She knew exactly how much profit Fairmont made each quarter. She knew which investments paid off and which ones lost money. She knew where Mr. Vance was cautious and where he took risks. She knew that he'd borrowed money from a Charleston bank 3 years ago to expand the plantation, and that the debt weighed heavily on the property's finances. She knew that last year's cotton crop had been disappointing, yielding 15% below projections, and that Mr. Vance had covered the shortfall by selling off some timberland. She knew things Mr. Vance probably didn't realize she knew, details buried in years of records that she'd absorbed while learning the system. And knowledge, as she'd learned, was a kind of freedom. Even if she was still enslaved, even if she still had no control over her own fate, at least she understood the numbers that governed her world. Della watched her daughter's transformation with mixed emotions. On one hand, Sarah was safer than most. The better quarters Mr. Vance had promised materialized, a private cabin for just the two of them, with a real floor and a chimney that didn't smoke. The food improved too, with regular allocations of meat and vegetables that other workers didn't receive. But Della could see the cost. Sarah was always tired, with dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. She had no friends her own age, no time for the small pleasures of youth. At 13, she should have been learning domestic skills, maybe being courted by young men, living whatever approximation of a normal life was possible in bondage. Instead, she spent her nights with ledgers and her days pretending to be someone she wasn't. "You're working yourself to death," Della said one morning, watching Sarah return from the office just as dawn was breaking. "I'm doing what I'm good at, Mama." "At what cost? You have no life beyond those books. Those books are my life. They're the only thing that makes me more than what everyone else says I am. And what do they say you are? Property, a tool, something with a value calculated in dollars." Sarah had pulled off her shawl and sat heavily on her bed. "But when I'm in that office, when I'm working with numbers, I'm not property. I'm a person with skills, with knowledge, with value that can't be measured in an auction price." Della had sat beside her daughter, putting an arm around her thin shoulders. "You are a person with value, whether you're in that office or not. You know that, don't you?" "I know, Mama, but sometimes it's hard to remember." The years passed in this rhythm. Sarah grew from a child into a young woman, her body changing even as her mind grew sharper. By 14, she could spot errors in invoices at a glance. By 15, she was making suggestions for improving efficiency, better crop rotation schedules, more advantageous timing for sales. By 16, she was essentially running Fairmont's financial operations, with Mr. Vance merely signing off on decisions she'd already calculated and planned. The plantation thrived under her management, though no one knew it was her management. Mr. Vance's reputation as a shrewd businessman grew. Other plantation owners would ask his advice, marvel at his organized records, comment on his impressive profit margins. And Mr. Vance would accept the praise, never mentioning the 16-year-old girl who did all the actual work. It created a strange dynamic between them. Mr. Vance needed Sarah desperately. She was irreplaceable at this point, the only person who fully understood Fairmont's complex financial systems. But he also resented that need, resented being dependent on someone he owned, someone he could never publicly acknowledge. Sometimes he'd test her, trying to catch her in an error. This calculation seems wrong. Which one, sir? The projected expenses for next quarter. Sarah would review her work, confident in her accuracy. I've checked it 3 times, sir. The number is correct. Show me your reasoning. And she would, explaining each step of her logic until Mr. Vance had to admit she was right. Other times he'd ask her opinion on decisions that had nothing to do with bookkeeping. Gray wants to try a new cotton variety in the East Fields. What do you think? Sarah would consider the question carefully. What's the cost difference in seeds? What's the projected yield increase? What are the risk factors if it fails? You tell me. You're the one with all the data. And Sarah would pull the relevant information from memory, calculate the risk-reward ratio, and give her recommendation. More often than not, Mr. Vance would follow her advice. It was power without acknowledgement, influence without recognition. But it was still power. And then James Fletcher arrived, and everything began to unravel. James Fletcher came to Fairmont in the spring of 1847 as the new overseer, replacing Mr. Stevens, who'd finally retired after 40 years of service. Fletcher was young for the position, perhaps 30, with sharp features and sharper eyes that seemed to notice everything. Where Stevens had been comfortable and predictable, Fletcher was ambitious and observant. Sarah noticed him immediately because he noticed her. Not in the way some men noticed young women. Fletcher showed no inappropriate interest, but he watched her the way a hawk watches a mouse, with an intensity that suggested he was trying to solve a puzzle. The first incident came a week after his arrival. Sarah had been crossing from the kitchen to the big house carrying a basket of linens when Fletcher had appeared seemingly from nowhere. "You're Della's daughter, aren't you?" Sarah had stopped, curtsied slightly. "Yes, sir." "What's your name?" "Sarah, sir." "And what are your duties here, Sarah?" "I help my mother in the big house, sir. Cleaning, laundry, whatever's needed." "I see." He'd looked at her appraisingly. "You seem quite capable. How old are you?" 16, sir." 16. And you've been working in the house your whole life?" "Yes, sir." "Never in the fields?" "No, sir. My mother worked in the house, so I was trained for the same." Fletcher had nodded slowly. "Interesting. Thank you, Sarah." He'd walked away, but Sarah had felt his gaze on her back. The question seemed innocent enough, but there was something about Fletcher's attention that set Sarah on edge. He was gathering information, building a picture of the plantation's operations, and Sarah had a feeling she didn't want to be a prominent part of that picture. Her concerns proved justified a few weeks later when she overheard Fletcher talking to Mr. Gray, the business manager. "The girl, Della's daughter, Sarah, why does she go to the office?" Sarah had been passing the open window of Gray's small workspace and had frozen at the sound of her name. "To clean, I assume," Gray had replied, sounding uninterested. "Mr. Vance is particular about that office being kept dust-free. At 4 in the morning, and again at 10 at night?" Sarah's blood had run cold. Fletcher had been watching her schedule, tracking her movements. "That does seem odd," Gray had admitted. "But Mr. Vance has his ways of doing things. Best not to question it. I'm the overseer. It's my job to question things that seem irregular." "Then question Mr. Vance directly, not me." Sarah had hurried away before she could hear more, but the damage was done. Fletcher knew about her unusual schedule. He was suspicious, and he was the type of man who wouldn't let suspicions rest until he had answers. She told Mr. Vance immediately. That evening, when she came to the office for her usual work session, Mr. Vance was waiting for her with an expression of barely contained frustration. "Fletcher has been asking about you." "I know, sir. I overheard him." "This is problematic. He's observant, and he's not satisfied with vague answers. I tried to deflect his questions, told him you clean the office, but he's clearly not convinced. What do we do, sir?" "You need to be more careful. Vary your schedule. Don't come every morning. Skip some days, work longer on others to compensate. Use different routes to get here. If Fletcher is watching, make it harder for him to establish a pattern." Sarah had nodded, but she'd known it might not be enough. Fletcher struck her as the persistent type, The kind of man who, once he'd latched onto a mystery, wouldn't let it go until he'd solved it. She'd been right. Over the following weeks, Fletcher's surveillance had continued. Sarah would catch glimpses of him in places he had no obvious reason to be. Near the path she usually took to the office, watching from the shadows of the stable, standing at windows that overlooked the areas she frequented. He started asking questions around the plantation. Who was Sarah? Why was she given preferential treatment? What was her relationship with Mr. Vance? The implications in that last question were ugly, and rumors began to spread. Whispered speculation about why a slave girl had private quarters, better food, access to the big house at all hours. Della was furious. "That man is going to get you in serious trouble," she'd hissed one night. "People are talking, Sarah, saying terrible things." "I know, Mama. I don't know how to stop it." "You stop it by staying away from that office. Let Mr. Vance find someone else to do his books. He needs me. The system is too complex for anyone else to learn quickly. I don't care what he needs. I care about keeping you safe." It was one of the few times Sarah had seen her mother truly angry, and it shook her, but she couldn't stop. The work was too important, too central to who she'd become. Without the ledgers, without the numbers, Sarah didn't know who she was anymore. The confrontation with Fletcher came on a morning when Sarah made a critical mistake. She'd been working on a complex financial projection, trying to determine whether Fairmont could afford to purchase an adjacent property that had come up for sale. The calculations had taken longer than expected, and Sarah had lost track of time. When she finally looked up from the ledgers, sunlight was streaming through the office window. It was past 7 o'clock. The plantation was awake, people were moving about, and Sarah was still in the office. She'd gathered her papers quickly, preparing to slip out, but when she opened the door, Fletcher was there, waiting. "Good morning, Sarah." His voice was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. "Early cleaning session?" Sarah's mind raced. "Yes, sir. Mr. Vance wanted the office especially tidy today. He's expecting a visitor." "Really? He didn't mention any visitor to me, and I oversee all comings and goings on this property." "Perhaps it slipped his mind, sir. Perhaps." Fletcher had taken a step closer, forcing Sarah to retreat back into the office. He'd followed her in, closing the door behind him. "Or perhaps you're not here to clean at all." "Sir, I don't know what you—" "I've been watching Sarah for weeks. And do you know what I've seen?" He'd moved to the desk where a ledger still lay open. "I've seen you enter this office in the dark of night and the dark of early morning. I've seen lights burning long past when any cleaning would take. And yesterday, I looked through this window right here." He'd tapped the glass. "And I saw you sitting at this desk, pen in hand, writing in Mr. Vance's private business ledgers." Sarah had felt ice in her stomach. "You're mistaken, sir. I would never—" "Don't insult my intelligence by lying." Fletcher's voice had turned hard. "I know what I saw. You're not cleaning. You're doing bookkeeping, actual accounting work. Which raises some very interesting questions. You'd have to ask Mr. Vance about that, sir. It's not my place to explain his business arrangements." "Oh, I'll ask Mr. Vance. Believe me, I will. But first I'm asking you." He'd leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "What's really going on here? Are you Mr. Vance's companion, and he's given you busy work to keep you occupied?" The insinuation was clear and disgusting. "No, sir. Nothing like that." "Then what? How does an enslaved girl end up doing an accountant's work?" Sarah had calculated rapidly. Fletcher already knew too much. Denying everything would just make him more suspicious and determined. But admitting the truth would expose Mr. Vance to scandal and herself to severe punishment. Before she could decide how to respond, the office door had opened and Della had appeared. "Mr. Fletcher," her mother had said, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Vance is looking for you. He said it's urgent." Something about the North Fields. It was a lie. Sarah could tell from the slight tension in her mother's shoulders, but Fletcher couldn't be sure of that. He'd studied Della for a moment, then pushed off from the desk. "Very well. But this conversation isn't over, Sarah. I will get to the bottom of this." He'd left, and Della had immediately pulled Sarah close. You need to be more careful. That man is dangerous. I know, Mama, I know. But being careful wasn't enough anymore. Fletcher had seen too much, suspected too much. The explosion was coming. Sarah could feel it. And when it came, she'd have to be ready. The confrontation Fletcher had been building toward finally erupted 2 weeks later during a dinner party at the big house. Mr. Vance was entertaining several neighboring plantation owners, Patterson, Harrison, and a wealthy merchant named Carlyle from Charleston. It was a show of status, an opportunity for Mr. Vance to display Fairmont's success and his own business acumen. Sarah had been helping serve, moving quietly between the kitchen and the dining room, keeping glasses filled and plates cleared. The conversation had centered on business, as it always did among these men. Cotton prices, labor management, the political situation in Washington. And then Harrison had commented, "You've done remarkably well these past few years, Vance. Your operation is the most profitable in the county. What's your secret?" Mr. Vance had smiled modestly. "Good planning, careful record-keeping, wise investments. Nothing mysterious about it." "Your ledgers are legendary," Carlyle had added. "I've heard other planters speak of them. Perfect organization, no errors. You must have an excellent accountant." "I manage the books myself, actually." "Really? That's impressive, given how extensive your operation is." And that's when Fletcher, who'd been standing near the doorway in his capacity as overseer, had spoken up. "That's not entirely accurate, sir." The dining room had fallen silent. All eyes had turned to Fletcher. Mr. Vance had gone very still. "What did you say?" "I said that's not entirely accurate. You don't manage the books yourself." "Fletcher, you're drunk. Retire to your quarters." "I'm not drunk, sir. And these gentlemen deserve to know the truth about Fairmont's famous record-keeping." Fletcher had stepped further into the room, emboldened by wine and self-righteousness. "Your perfect ledgers, your complex financial analyses, your impressive business decisions, they're not your work at all. Enough. They're the work of a 16-year-old slave girl who shouldn't even be able to write her own name." The gasps from the dinner guests had been audible. Sarah, standing in the corner with a wine pitcher, had felt every eye in the room turn toward her. "That's absurd," Patterson had said, but his tone was uncertain. "Is it?" Fletcher had challenged. "Ask Vance. Ask him if what I'm saying is true." Mr. Vance had stood slowly, his face a mixture of fury and humiliation. "You're dismissed, Fletcher. Pack your belongings and be off my property by morning. Dismiss me if you want, but they deserve to know. You've been deceiving everyone, claiming credit for work you didn't do, letting a slave manage your business while you take the praise." Harrison had leaned forward. "Vance, there can't be any truth to this. Tell us there isn't." And Mr. Vance had faced a choice in that moment. Deny everything and maintain the fiction, or admit to at least part of the truth and try to control the narrative. He'd chosen the middle path. There's a grain of truth in Fletcher's accusations, twisted by malice and misunderstanding. His voice had been controlled, measured. "When my last accountant died 3 years ago, I found myself without anyone to maintain the records. During that time, the old man had trained his household servant to do simple copying and filing. After his death, I discovered she had an unusual aptitude for numbers. I allowed her to continue doing basic transcription work, copying entries I'd already calculated, organizing papers I'd already reviewed. Nothing more. The actual accounting, the business decisions, those are mine." It was a skillful deflection, admitting to something small to hide something much larger. Carlyle had frowned. "Even that seems highly irregular, Vance. Having an enslaved person, especially a young girl, involved in confidential business records. It was a temporary necessity that became a convenience. She's trustworthy, discreet, and has saved me considerable time on clerical work. But to suggest she's actually doing the accounting, making business decisions, that's Fletcher's invention, based on misunderstood observations." Fletcher had laughed bitterly. "Misunderstood? I've watched her, Vance. I've seen her at that desk, making entries, doing calculations. She's not just copying, she's..." You've seen what you wanted to see. Mr. Vance had cut him off. Projected your own suspicions onto innocent activities. Now leave. Immediately. Security had escorted Fletcher from the room, still protesting, still insisting he was right. But the damage was done. The dinner guests had left earlier than planned, making polite excuses. And within a week, rumors were spreading across the county. Thomas Vance, they whispered, had an enslaved girl doing his bookkeeping. Some versions of the story made Sarah out to be a savant. Others suggested more nefarious reasons for her privileges. The truth became lost in speculation and scandal. Mr. Vance's reputation took a hit. Other planters looked at him with suspicion. When he'd speak at agricultural society meetings, men would murmur about whether his advice was really his own. Business partners began requesting independent audits of transactions, no longer willing to simply trust his records. 3 days after the dinner party, Mr. Vance summoned Sarah to his study. She'd known this was coming, had been preparing for it. "This arrangement is over," Mr. Vance had said without preamble. "The talk is damaging my standing. I can't afford to have you working on the records anymore." "I understand, sir. I'll be hiring a new accountant, someone from Charleston who hasn't heard the stories. It will take time to find the right person, but in the meantime, you'll need the books organized so the new accountant can take over smoothly." "Exactly." Mr. Vance had looked at her with something that might have been regret. "I need you to prepare everything. Create a system so simple that even a mediocre accountant can maintain it. Detailed guides, clear instructions, comprehensive indexes. Can you do that?" It was one final task. One last chance to touch the work that had defined her for 4 years. "Yes, sir. I can do that. You have 2 weeks. After that, you'll return to regular household duties. You and your mother will keep the private cabin. That much I can justify. But the special privileges end." Sarah had nodded, unsurprised, but feeling the loss anyway. "There's one more thing," Mr. Vance had added. "Fletcher was right about some of it. You did more than just copying. I know that. You probably know this plantation's finances better than I do." Sarah had said nothing, neither confirming nor denying. "I want you to know, I am grateful for your work, for your discretion, under different circumstances." He'd trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish that thought. "Just prepare the transition materials. And Sarah, after you're done, forget everything you learned for your own safety. Forget all of it." As if she could. As if 4 years of knowledge could simply be erased. "Yes, sir," she'd said anyway. And so Sarah had begun her final task, organizing her own obsolescence. The 2 weeks Sarah had been given to prepare the transition stretched into 3 as the scope of the work became clear. 4 years of complex financial systems needed to be documented in a way that someone with basic accounting skills could understand and maintain. Sarah worked methodically, creating detailed guides for every aspect of Fairmont's bookkeeping. She wrote a master index for all the ledgers, explaining what each one contained and how they cross-referenced. She created step-by-step instructions for common transactions, how to record a cotton sale, how to process payroll, how to handle equipment purchases. She compiled templates for monthly reports, quarterly summaries, and annual tax preparations. And as she worked, she noticed something she'd missed before. New discrepancies, recent ones. At first, she'd thought they were errors, perhaps entries Mr. Vance had made himself during the brief periods when he tried to maintain the books without her help. But as she looked closer, she saw a pattern. Purchases from a textile supplier in Charleston. Regular orders of cloth for worker clothing, purchased at prices that seemed reasonable at first glance. But when Sarah checked the actual quantities delivered against the number of people on the plantation and the amount of cloth each person would need annually, the numbers didn't match. Too much cloth was being purchased. Far too much. She'd cross-referenced with the storage records. The cloth wasn't accumulating in inventory. It was being recorded as distributed and used. But Sarah had helped her mother distribute clothing for years. She knew how much fabric actually went to the quarters, and it was nowhere near the amount being recorded in the books. Someone was skimming. Again. But this time, the signatures on the purchase orders weren't Crawford's. He'd been gone for 3 years. They were Mr. Vance's own. Sarah had sat in the office late one night, staring at the evidence, feeling something cold and terrible settle in her chest. She'd gone back through the records, looking for the pattern's origin. And she'd found it. The purchases had started 2 years ago, shortly after a particular entry she'd somehow missed before. A loan. A massive loan from the Bank of Charleston, taken out in June 1845. Sarah had never seen the original loan documents. Those were apparently kept elsewhere, possibly in Mr. Vance's personal safe. But the payments were recorded in the ledgers. $12,000 annually, paid to the bank like clockwork. $12,000 was a staggering sum. Why would Mr. Vance have needed such a loan? Sarah had gone searching through older records, ledgers from before her time, before even Herbert's time, and there, in a ledger from 1836, she'd found the answer. Mr. Vance's father, the previous owner of Fairmont, had died with enormous debts. Gambling debts, investment losses, money borrowed and never repaid. When Thomas Vance inherited the plantation, he'd also inherited those obligations. He'd managed to consolidate them into a single loan from the Bank of Charleston, using Fairmont itself as collateral. The plantation was mortgaged to pay for his father's mistakes. Thomas Vance didn't own Fairmont outright. The bank did. He was essentially a caretaker, running the operation and trying to earn enough profit to eventually pay off the loan and secure clear title to the property. But the plantation wasn't earning enough. Sarah could see it in the numbers. Revenue was declining, cotton prices had dropped over the past 2 years, and yields had been below average. Expenses were rising, the profit margins were shrinking. At the current rate, Mr. Vance would never pay off the loan. Eventually, he'd default, and the bank would foreclose. So he'd started stealing from his own operation. Small amounts, skimmed from purchase budgets and routed to a personal account. Money he was saving for when the inevitable happened, when he lost Fairmont and needed to start over somewhere else. Sarah had stared at the ledgers, seeing the full picture for the first time. Mr. Vance was a failing businessman desperately trying to hide his failure. That's why he'd accepted her help so readily. Not because he valued her skills, but because he needed someone loyal, someone who couldn't leave or tell others, someone who would keep perfect records that would hide his theft from bank auditors. She'd been useful, a tool to help him maintain the fiction of success while he quietly prepared to flee. And now that she was a liability, now that rumors had made her a risk to his reputation, he was discarding her. Sarah had sat in that office until dawn, thinking. She thought about Herbert, who'd taught her because he believed knowledge shouldn't be wasted. She thought about her mother, who'd protected her secret for years. She thought about all the people on Fairmont Plantation whose lives would be disrupted when the bank eventually foreclosed, when they were sold off to pay debts. And she thought about the ledgers themselves, those volumes full of numbers that told the truth even when people lied. By the time the sun rose, Sarah had made her decision. She couldn't save Fairmont. She couldn't stop the eventual collapse. But she could make sure the truth came out. She could ensure that when Mr. Vance's house of cards finally fell, people would know why. Sarah had carefully prepared a set of documents. She'd pulled the relevant entries showing the inflated textile purchases. She'd documented the loan from the Bank of Charleston. She'd calculated the shortfall between Fairmont's actual profits and the amount needed to service the debt. And she'd written a clear, concise explanation of what the numbers meant, how the pattern showed systematic embezzlement, how Mr. Vance was stealing from his own mortgaged property. She'd made 2 copies of everything. One she'd hidden in her cabin, sewn into the lining of her mattress. The other she'd placed between 2 specific pages of the current ledger, the pages that the new accountant would have to review first when taking over the books. Along with the evidence, she'd written a simple note in her careful script. Check the textile purchases against actual inventory and distribution. Compare prices with other vendors. Follow the money to the personal account. The numbers tell the story. She hadn't signed it. She didn't need to. Then Sarah had finished her transition guides, organized the office one final time, and left. Her work at Fairmont was done. Now she just had to wait for the consequences. The new accountant, Richard Hayes, arrived from Charleston on a gray Tuesday in late April. He was unremarkable in every way. Average height, average build, with thinning brown hair and a forgettable face. Exactly the kind of safe, conventional choice Mr. Vance needed after the scandal with Sarah. Hayes came with solid references and no knowledge of Fairmont's complicated history. He seemed genuinely pleased to have secured the position, oblivious to the fact that he was the fifth accountant in 8 years. Sarah watched from a distance as Mr. Vance showed Hayes to the office, introduced him to the organized ledgers, explained the system that Mr. Vance had personally developed and maintained. No mention of Sarah, no acknowledgement of her 4 years of work. She'd expected that. It still stung. For the first 2 days, Hayes simply reviewed the existing records, familiarizing himself with Fairmont's operations. Sarah went about her regular household duties, helping her mother, trying to pretend that a chapter of her life hadn't just ended. On the 3rd day, she heard raised voices coming from the office. She'd been passing nearby with a laundry basket. Not coincidentally, she'd made a point of being in the area. Through the open window, she could hear Hayes and Mr. Vance in heated discussion. "These entries don't make sense, sir," Hayes was saying. "The quantities are far too high, and the prices when I compare them to standard market rates. There must be a mistake in the calculations, Mr. Vance had replied, his voice strained. "I'll review them myself. I've already reviewed them 3 times. The numbers are accurate. What doesn't match is the physical reality. We don't have this much cloth. We can't possibly have distributed this much, which means either the records are wrong or what? Or someone has been embezzling significant sums through fraudulent purchase orders." Silence. Sarah had pressed herself against the wall beneath the window, listening intently. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Hayes." "I'm not making an accusation, sir. I'm pointing out a discrepancy in the accounts. As your accountant, I'm obligated to bring such things to your attention. I appreciate your diligence, but I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Perhaps the previous accountant made errors. Perhaps. But there's more, sir. I found a note tucked between these pages. It suggested I look into these specific purchases and follow the money trail. Someone wanted me to find this." "A note? What kind of note?" "Just a piece of paper with instructions, very specific instructions about what to examine. Almost as if someone who understood your financial systems wanted to expose a problem." Mr. Vance had been silent for a long moment. Then, "My former assistant. It must have been her. A final act of sabotage after I dismissed her." "Your former assistant was the young woman I saw helping in the house? She understood financial systems well enough to identify embezzlement?" "She had some limited training, enough to make mischief apparently. With respect, sir, whoever wrote that note had more than limited training. They understood complex accounting principles, cross-referencing, pattern analysis, and more importantly, the information appears to be accurate. These purchases are fraudulent. Mr. Hayes, I'll handle this matter personally. You needn't concern yourself." "Actually, sir, I do need to concern myself. According to the documents you showed me when I was hired, the Bank of Charleston holds the primary mortgage on this property. As part of the loan agreement, they have the right to audit the accounts at any time. If they discover irregularities and I, as the accountant of record, failed to report them, I could be held liable." "Are you threatening me, Hayes?" "No, sir. I'm explaining my professional obligations. If there's evidence of embezzlement or fraud in these books, I need to report it to the appropriate authorities. That's not a choice. It's a legal requirement." Sarah had heard footsteps, then a door slamming. Mr. Vance must have left. That night, Mr. Vance didn't come home. Sarah learned the next morning from the household gossip that he'd been seen riding toward Charleston late in the evening, a single bag strapped to his horse. By noon it was clear he wasn't returning. Mrs. Vance had been distraught, demanding answers from the staff. But no one knew anything. Hayes, meanwhile, had sent an urgent message to the Bank of Charleston, reporting suspected financial irregularities and the property owner's abrupt disappearance. The bank's response was swift. A representative arrived within 2 days. A stern, efficient man named Mr. Williams, who'd come to assess the situation and protect the bank's interests. He'd taken over the office immediately, reviewing every ledger with Hayes at his side. They'd worked for a full day, examining the records, calculating losses, determining the scope of Mr. Vance's theft. Sarah had watched from various vantage points, seeing the grim expressions, the shaking heads, the steadily growing pile of flagged entries. On the 3rd day, Mr. Williams had called a meeting of the household staff. "Thomas Vance has defaulted on his loan through criminal misconduct," he'd announced. "The Bank of Charleston is assuming immediate control of this property. All operations will continue as normal while we determine how to proceed. But you should be aware that Fairmont will likely be sold to satisfy the debt." Murmurs of worry had rippled through the assembled workers. "What about us?" someone had called out. "Will we be sold?" "That will be determined by whoever purchases the property. The bank's priority is recovering the loan value. I can't make promises beyond that." Fear had spread through the quarters that night. Being sold was every enslaved person's nightmare. Families separated, people sent to different states, children torn from parents. Sarah and Della had held each other in their cabin, knowing that their relatively comfortable life at Fairmont was ending, uncertain what would replace it. The next morning, Mr. Williams had sent for Sarah. She'd approached the office with trepidation, unsure what to expect. Williams and Hayes were both there, seated at the desk, a ledger open between them. "Sarah, correct?" Williams had asked. "Yes, sir. Mr. Hayes has informed me that you had some involvement with maintaining these records. Is that accurate?" Sarah had glanced at Hayes, trying to read his expression. He'd looked back neutrally, giving nothing away. "I helped Mr. Crane, the previous accountant, sir. He taught me some basic bookkeeping." "Basic bookkeeping," Williams had repeated, a note of skepticism in his voice. "Mr. Hayes, show her the entry from March 3rd. Hayes had pointed to a line in the ledger. "Can you explain what this entry means?" Williams had asked. Sarah had scanned it quickly. "It's a cotton futures sale, sir. 200 bales contracted for delivery in October at $48 per bale. Total value $9,600. And this notation here?" Williams had pointed to a marginal note. "That's the hedge calculation. If the market price drops below $45 per bale by delivery date, we still profit. But if it rises above 52, we would have been better off waiting to sell. The notation marks the acceptable risk range." Williams and Hayes had exchanged a glance. "Basic bookkeeping," Williams had said dryly. "Miss Sarah, I've reviewed these ledgers extensively. The entries from the past 4 years show a level of sophistication and attention to detail that exceeds most professional accountants I've worked with. The cross-referencing system, the projection models, the risk analysis, this is expert work." Sarah had said nothing, unsure where this was leading. "I've also found this." Williams had held up the note Sarah had left. "This is your handwriting, isn't it?" Yes, sir. You left this information for Mr. Hayes to find. You exposed Mr. Vance's theft, knowing it would trigger an investigation. I just wanted the truth known, sir. The numbers should be honest." Williams had studied her for a long moment. "You're remarkably talented, and clearly principled, which is rare. The bank is going to maintain operations here while we find a buyer. That means we need someone to manage the records in the interim. Mr. Hayes will serve as the official accountant of record, yes. Society and the law require that. But we both know these books need someone who truly understands them, someone who knows Fairmont's operations intimately." He'd paused. "I'd like to offer you an unusual arrangement. Sir, you'll continue managing the actual ledgers. Mr. Hayes will review your work and serve as the public face, but you'll do the detailed accounting. In exchange, you and your mother will remain at Fairmont with protected status." You'll be compensated with better conditions, and I'll make sure that when this property is eventually sold, your sales contracts include specific guarantees." "What kind of guarantees?" "That you and your mother won't be separated, that you'll continue in administrative roles rather than field work, that your new owner will be someone who values skilled labor appropriately." It wasn't freedom, but it was protection and acknowledgement of her skills. "Why would you do this, sir?" Sarah had asked. Williams had smiled slightly. "Because I'm a banker, Miss Sarah. I understand value and I know waste when I see it. Your mind is worth more than any field labor could ever generate. It would be poor business to waste such an asset." He'd paused. "And because that note you left showed more integrity than most free men I know. The bank appreciates integrity." Sarah had looked at her mother, who'd been called in and was standing near the door. Della had looked back at her daughter, then nodded slowly. "I accept, sir. Thank you." And so Sarah's official role as Fairmont's accountant, hidden behind Hayes's public presence, had begun. Fairmont Plantation was sold in November of 1847 to a family from Virginia named the Randolphs. They were younger than the Vances, more progressive in some of their thinking, and willing to accept the unusual staffing arrangement the bank had insisted upon as part of the sale. Sarah continued her work, now with marginally more acknowledgement. The Randolphs knew she was essential to the operation, treated her with a certain respect, even occasionally asked her opinion on business matters directly. It wasn't freedom. She was still enslaved, still property, still bound to the land and the people who owned it. But she had a role, a purpose, a skill that made her valuable in ways that transcended the brutal calculations of the human property ledger. And she began doing something new, something just for herself. In a hidden journal, using a simple cipher she'd developed, Sarah started keeping different records, not business accounts, not financial ledgers. She recorded the names of every enslaved person on Fairmont, their families, their skills, their stories, their humanity. When children were born, she noted it, not as an acquisition or an increase in property value, but as a birth, a new life, with parents' names and hopes recorded. When people died, she wrote their names with respect, listed what they'd been good at, who they'd loved, what small joys they'd found in hard lives. When couples formed relationships, she documented them. Not legal marriages, those weren't allowed, but bonds of affection and commitment that deserved recognition. It was her own ledger, her own truth, separate from the plantation's official records. She wrote about the small rebellions, the tool accidentally broken on a day when someone was too sick to work safely, the extra food smuggled from the kitchen to a family struggling, the songs sung in the quarters that carried coded messages of resistance. She wrote about moments of beauty, a wedding celebration, unauthorized but joyfully held, a child taking their first steps, a garden blooming with vegetables that supplemented the sparse rations. She documented everything the official ledgers never captured: the human cost of the institution, the resilience of people who refused to be reduced to property values, the dignity maintained in undignified circumstances. The journal grew over years, filled with names and stories and truths that would otherwise have been lost. Sarah knew it was dangerous to keep such records. If discovered, it would be proof of her literacy, evidence that could be used against her. But she'd spent too many years maintaining books that reduced people to numbers. This was her counterledger, her testimony that they were more than what the world claimed. She kept the journal hidden, sewn into her mattress lining, the same place she'd once hidden the evidence against Mr. Vance. And she continued her double life. By day, the accountant who kept Fairmont's financial records perfect. By night, the chronicler who preserved the story's numbers couldn't tell. Years later, long after Sarah's death, after the Civil War had ended and Fairmont had changed hands multiple times, the journal was discovered during renovations. Historians found it sealed in a tin box, hidden in a wall cavity in one of the old cabins. The pages were yellowed but readable, filled with precise handwriting in a simple substitution cipher that took weeks to decode. When they finally read its contents, they found a treasure, a complete record of enslaved life from 1847 to 1861, written in intimate detail by someone with education and insight. There were debates about its authenticity. How could an enslaved person have had such education? Who had taught them to write so well, to organize information so clearly? The handwriting experts compared it to Fairmont's old financial ledgers, the ones preserved in the County Historical Society. They found remarkable similarities in the script. Further research uncovered mentions of Sarah in scattered documents. A bill of sale from 1847 listing her as Sarah, 16, house servant, literate, unusual, skilled in accounts. A letter from the Bank of Charleston praising the colored girl who maintains our ledgers at the Fairmont property with exceptional skill. Pieces of the truth emerged, though never the complete picture. What remained clear was the journal itself, that meticulous record of human lives, preserved by someone who understood that numbers could tell truth, but stories revealed humanity. Sarah's legacy was dual. She'd kept the books that measured a plantation's wealth in cotton and dollars, and she'd kept the book that measured its true cost in human suffering and resilience. Both ledgers mattered. Both told truth, but only one told the whole truth. And in the end, that was the one that survived. The numbers remained, the stories endured, and Sarah's voice, silent for so long, finally spoke.